Go right ahead.
Well, hello and welcome everyone to Learning from Home, and welcome to the patrons of the Hewlett-Woodmere Public Library for today's presentation of King Arthur, History and Legend. My name is Dr. Bill Thierfelder, and I'll be your host today. Now, for those of you who don't know me, I'm a retired professor of arts and humanities and a docent emeritus from the American Museum of Natural History in New York. I live in Portland, Oregon, where I'm speaking to you from today, and where I'm an artist, writer, and lecturer. But I also do return regularly to New York, where I continue my work at the museum and enjoy the wonders of the Big Apple. Now, because we can't look at every aspect of this enormous topic in one program, I'd like to invite you to visit my website, makingwings.net, and take deeper dive number 87. And let me demonstrate for you. So it's one word, making wings, and it's .net. And I always like to make sure, double check here. You will be brought to my homepage. If you go to the hamburger menu in the upper left corner and you click on that, hello, you will be getting a drop down. You may visit any of these, including my lecture schedule if you're interested in other programs. But for this program today, you're going to want to go to the deeper dives. And in this particular case, since it's number 87, the second batch, click on the arrow, not the words, but the arrow. And you'll again see a drop down. These are all programs that I either have given or will be giving in the future. So again, please feel free to visit. But today is number 87, King Arthur. And when you do that, and I'm actually probably going to be adding to this a little layer. I realized I forgot something that I'd like to embellish, but what I do have so far is um, information on the historical Arthur, some recommended media. Now, I'll be talking about some of these books within the presentation. If you don't have a paper and pencil handy, you can go to the website to copy down titles and authors, web resources in print and in video, and various things like Arthur's name, for example, and the whole history of Arthurian myth and legend. I'm going to be adding a section when we're done with our program today about some of the big players, if you will, in Arthurian romance. People like Guinevere and Lancelot, etc. So stay tuned for that. But now, if, for example, you want to, let's say, look at an overview about King Arthur, here's one from Wikipedia. If you click on that, you'll be brought to that page and you can explore. And then when you're done, all you do is click it off and you're back on my page. So it's kind of like one-stop shopping. And I got a whole bunch of videos there on some of these great characters. So just have fun with that. Uh, And as I say, I'm going to be adding a couple of things a little later on. Now, everything that you will hear in the program today uses the web resources and the books that you see on my website. And for this presentation, I especially use the following sources to build its structure and its script. PBS, the BBC program called History Extra, and the History Channel. Um, I also used Smithsonian Magazine, Expedition Magazine, and the database research website called EBSCO. Excellent, excellent. Has a lot of references to many different articles. So if you go to EBSCO and you click in, put in King Arthur, um, gosh, you can go down a rabbit hole for hours. And then vetted articles from Britannica and Wikipedia. Now, as you did see on my website, there is a section called Recommended Media. Artorias, The Real King Arthur by Linda Malker and John Matthews, explores the historical evidence for the legendary king. The 2004 film starring Clive Owen as King Arthur is a really fine look at how a historical figure became the basis for later legends. I recommend it, it's good. The Oxford Guide to Arthurian Literature and Legend by Alan Lupeck is a thorough examination of the dozens upon dozens of books, plays, and poems about Arthur and the Round Table. Now, here are three more sources you might want to check out. King Arthur, The True Story by Graham Phillips and Martin Keatman. King Arthur, Man or Myth by Tony Sullivan. And King Arthur, The Truth Behind the Legend by Rodney Castleton. All three books argue that not only did Arthur exist as a chieftain in the post-Roman world, but that many of the romantic tales of Merlin, Camelot, and Excalibur are potentially rooted in some kind of truth. Not saying that those stories are true, but, where there's smoke, there's fire. So there's some historical precedence to some of these stories. These three books offer a very complete picture of Arthur's Britain and his place in it. So, with that said, just do that. So with that said, let's start with the obvious. King Arthur is a central figure in the medieval literary tradition known as the Matter of Britain. Now, the Matter of Britain is the body of medieval literature and legendary material associated with Great Britain and Brittany, and the legendary kings and heroes associated with it, particularly King Arthur. It is one of the three great Western story cycles of medieval literature. The other two are the Matter of France, which are the legends about Charlemagne, and the Matter of Rome, which includes material derived from or inspired by classical mythology and classical history. Now, for a much more complete look at the enormous body of literature called The Matter of Britain, this Wikipedia entry is a great place to start because it has links to both the writers and the individual works, and I've included the link on my website. So we have here The Matter of Britain, and you can see in the contents on the side here all kinds of things, themes and subjects, literature by named author, by anonymous authors, etc., etc. It's really a superb site. So let's dive in. Matter of Britain. The earliest stories of Arthur come from Wales, and in these sources, Arthur is portrayed as a leader of the post-Roman Britons in battles against Anglo-Saxon invaders of Britain in the late 5th and early 6th century. He first appears in the Annales Cambriae and the Historia Britonum, but these date to 300 years after he is supposed to have lived. His name also appears in early Welsh poems, such as Y Gododdin. In these works, Arthur appears either as a great warrior defending Britain from human and supernatural enemies, or as a kind of magical figure of folklore, sometimes associated with the Welsh underworld or other world called Annwn, Annwn. Now, the legendary Arthur developed as a figure of international interest, largely through the popularity of Geoffrey of Monmouth's fanciful and imaginative 12th century Historia Regum Britanniae, which is the history of kings of Britain. I've also heard it pronounced Britanniae or Britanniae. Geoffrey depicts Arthur as a king of Britain who defeated the Saxons and established a vast empire. Many elements and incidents are now an integral part of the Arthurian story. And they appear first in Geoffrey's Historia, including Arthur's father, Uther Pendragon, the magician Merlin, Arthur's wife Guinevere, the sword Excalibur, Arthur's conception at Tintagel, and his mortal battle against Mordred, as well as his final resting place in Avalon. I'm going to talk more about some of these books a little later on, but I just want to kind of get you started. Where do we find the first references? Now, the 12th century French writer Chrétien de Troyes, who added Lancelot and the Holy Grail to the story, began the genre of what's called Arthurian romance that became a significant strand of medieval literature. Now, in these French stories, the narrative focus often shifts from King Arthur himself to other characters, such as the Knights of the Round Table. Now, it's important to remember that the themes, events, and characters of the Arthurian legend vary widely from text to text. So there's no one definitive version. There's no canonical version of the King Arthur story. Arthurian literature thrived during the Middle Ages, but actually waned in the centuries that followed until it experienced a major resurgence in the 19th century. In the 21st century, the legend continues to have prominence, not only in literature, but also in theater, film, television, comics, and other media. Now, if you'd like to get more of a sense of the dozens and dozens of characters that inhabit all of the legends from the medieval period to the present, then these websites will be helpful. And the links to them are available on my website. Now, one site called MythBank, absolutely great. It's called MythBank. And again, I have the link on my website. Arthurian characters, a complete list of characters. And you can see the remarkable table of contents here. It's really, really thorough. And then we have, again, a Wikipedia page, a list of Arthurian characters. Now, this one is really fascinating. It is alphabetical. It gives other alternate names, its earliest appearance, the work that it is featured in, and a description of who the person actually is. So again, it's everything you wanted to know about every character. And again, I don't want to make you dizzy here, but I mean, it is literally A to Z. I mean, it's wow. It's hundreds of characters. So very complete. So MythBank, Wikipedia, Arthurian characters. Now, what we're going to look at now is whether there's a basis for historical King Arthur. Since the mid-1800s, when there was a revival of interest in Arthur, there's always been the hope that evidence for a real King Arthur, the Arthur beyond all those wonderful Camelot and Avalon stories, could actually be found. So let's dive in. The historical basis for Arthur has been long debated by scholars. One school of thought cites entries in the Historia Brittonum and the Annales Cambriae, the Welsh annals. Both of these works from Wales saw Arthur as a genuine historical figure, a Romano-British leader who fought against the invading Anglo-Saxons sometime in the late 5th to the early 6th century. The Historia Brittonum, a 9th century Latin historical compilation attributed to a Welsh cleric named Nennius, contains the first datable mention of King Arthur, and it lists 12 battles that Arthur fought. And they culminate, those battles, in the Battle of Badon, where he is said to have single-handedly killed 960 men. Now, recent archaeological evidence shows that early Anglo-Saxon migration to Great Britain reversed between the years 500 and 550. And that would be consistent with the British victory at Badon's Hill. And so some historians cite that, well, gee, maybe there's some historicity here. There's some historical basis. Now, the other text that seems to support the case for Arthur's historical existence is the 10th century Annales Cambriae, the Welsh Chronicles, which also links Arthur with the Battle of Badon. However, the latest research shows that the Chronicles is based on writings begun in the late 8th century. Simply put, both the Annales Cambriae and the Historia Brittonum were written down at least 200 to 300 years or more after Arthur's supposed reign. So, how accurate are they? Now, this lack of convincing early evidence is the reason many recent historians exclude Arthur from their accounts of sub-Roman Britain. In the view of the historian Thomas Charles Edwards, at this stage of the inquiry, one can only say that there may well have been a historical Arthur, but the historian can as yet say nothing of value about him because they can't prove it. Now, these modern admissions of ignorance are a relatively recent trend. Early generations of historians were less skeptical. For example, the historian John Morris, in his book, The Age of Arthur, in 1973, I say that he's on Team Arthur, made his belief in the reign of a historical Arthur the focus of his history of sub-Roman Britain and Ireland. Now, the term sub-Roman means the period following the Roman occupation, but before the Anglo-Saxon settlements in the 5th and 6th centuries CE. Now, no Team Arthur. Partly in reaction to such theories, another school of thought emerged, which argued that Arthur has no historical existence at all. Archaeologist Noel Myers observes that no figure on the borderline of history and mythology has wasted more of the historian's time. Ouch. He cites as proof Gildas' 6th century book on the ruin and conquest of Britain, written within living memory of Badon, which mentions the battle but does not mention Arthur. Further, Arthur is not mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is probably the most famous document from this period. It was an annual diary, if you will, that was kept for hundreds of years by scribes and monks, and not mentioned in any of those documents written between 400 and 820. He's also absent from the Venerable Bede's early 8th century ecclesiastical history of the English people, which is another major source, early source for post-Roman history. The historian David Dumville wrote bluntly, "I think we can dispose of Arthur quite briefly. There is no historical evidence about Arthur. We must reject him from our histories and, above all, from the titles of our books." Ouch. Now, continuing with Team No Arthur, some scholars argue that Arthur was originally a fictional hero of folklore or even a half-forgotten Celtic deity who later became credited with actual real deeds in the distant past. And the early texts where he does appear, well, he's actually never called king. For example, in the Historia Brittonum, he's simply called Dux Bellorum, leader of wars, or Miles, which means a soldier. More Team No Arthur. Details of Arthur's story are mainly composed of Welsh mythology, English folklore, and literary invention. And most historians now do not think that he was a historical figure. Simply put, because historical documents for the post-Roman period are scarce, a definitive answer to the question of Arthur's historical existence is unlikely. Further, there are no geographical sites that have been identified as Arthurian since the 12th century. And they're now considered, and even those that have been identified are now considered questionable. For example, the so-called Arthur Stone, discovered in 1998 among the ruins at Tintagel Castle in Cornwall, was dated to the 6th century of the Common Era, which would have been his era, but the inscriptions proved to be problematic at best. Other inscriptional evidence for Arthur, including the now lost, conveniently, Glastonbury Cross, is now believed to be a forgery. Well, Arthur Breeze has recently argued, and here we go to Team Arthur. He's argued that Arthur was historical. Breeze claims to have identified the location of his battles as well as the place and date of his death in the context of the extreme weather events of 535 to 536. But his conclusions are disputed. Meanwhile, other scholars have questioned Breeze's findings. Nicholas Hyam, for example, comments that it is difficult to justify identifying Arthur as the leader in northern battles listed in the Historia Brittonum. It is difficult to prove that they were fought against Anglo-Saxons, and that there is no textual justification for separating Bandon from the other battles mentioned in the text. Well, several historical figures have been proposed as the basis for Arthur. I call this team, your guess is as good as mine. They range from Lucius Arturus Castus, a Roman officer who served in Britain in the 2nd or 3rd century, to sub-Roman British rulers such as Arietamus, Ambrosius Aurelianus, and the Welsh kings Owen de Dagwin, Eowyn Gert, and Athres ap Mirig. Well, unfortunately, there's really no convincing evidence for these identifications as well. So your guess is as good as mine. So the point is, we may not know whether there was a historical Arthur, but we do know that he appears in medieval literary traditions. And that's what we're going to explore a little further in this next section. So whether he existed or not almost seems irrelevant. He is such a remarkable character, and a character that has influenced movies, music, literature, right down to the present day. Now, the familiar literary persona of Arthur begins with Geoffrey of Monmouth's kind of pseudo-historical Historia Regum Britanniae, the history of the kings of Britain, written in the 1130s. The textual sources for Arthur are usually divided into those written before Geoffrey's Historia, known as pre-Galfridian texts from the Latin form of Geoffrey, Galfridus, and those written afterwards, which are influenced by his book. These are called Galfridian or post-Galfridian texts. Okay, and now, not trying to be too technical here, but sometimes if you really want to go down the rabbit hole and really discover more about Arthur, you're going to see those terms, pre-Galfridian and Galfridian or post-Galfridian. And that simply means books before and books after Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain. So when we talk about the great pre-Galfridian texts, as I said before, the earliest literary references to Arthur come from Welsh and Breton sources. Scholar Caitlin Green, in her book, Concepts of Arthur, you see that over in the right corner of your screen, she identifies 3 key strands to the portrayal of Arthur in this early material. The first is that he was a peerless warrior who functioned as the monster-hunting protector of Britain from all internal and external threats. Some of these are human threats, such as the Saxons he fights, but the majority are supernatural, including giant cat monsters, destructive divine boars, dragons, dogheads, giants, and witches. The second strand is that the pre-Galfredian Arthur was a figure of folk and localized magical wonder tales, and the leader of a band of superhuman heroes who live in the wilds of the landscape. The third and final strand is that the early Welsh Arthur had a close connection with the Welsh otherworld, or the underworld, Anwen. So, on the one hand, he launches assaults on otherworldly fortresses in search of treasure and frees their prisoners. And on the other, his war band, mentioned in the early sources, includes former pagan gods, and his wife and his possessions are clearly otherworldly in origin. So that even means that Guinevere is otherworldly. Now, references to Arthur in the pre-Galfredian Welsh poetic tradition can be found in the collection of heroic death songs known as Igodadin, attributed to the 6th century poet Aneurin, and several poems attributed to Taliesin, a poet said to have lived in the 6th century, also refer to Arthur. His poems include the Chair of the Prince, which refers to Arthur as the Blessed One, the Spoils of Anwen, which recounts an expedition of Arthur to the other world, and the Elegy of Uther Pendragon, which refers to Arthur's valor and the relationship Arthur had with his father, Uther. Other early Welsh Arthurian texts include a poem found in the Black Book of Carmarthen, the Welsh prose tale Coleridge and Olwen, dated from around 1100 of the Common Era, and in what are called the Welsh triads. And in all of these, Arthur is said to be, quote, chief of the lords of this island, unquote, meaning he's the overlord of Wales, Cornwall, and the lands north of Cornwall. In addition to these pre-Galfredian Welsh poems and tales, starting in the 11th century, Arthur features prominently in a number of well-known saints' lives, the lives of saints, a very popular form of medieval literature. For example, according to the life of St. Gildas, written in the early 12th century, Arthur is said to have rescued his wife Guinevere from the monastery at Glastonbury. And in the life of St. Cadog, written around 1100, the St. Cadog gives protection to a man who killed 3 of Arthur's soldiers. And William of Malmesbury provides some of the first certain evidence for a belief that Arthur was not actually dead and would at some point return. And that's a theme that is often revisited in post-Galfredian folklore. Well, now we come to that demarcation. So everything has been, before this has been pre-Galfredian. Now you have the Galfredian work. Again, Galfreda is the Latin form of Geoffrey. Now we come to Geoffrey of Monmouth and his History of the Kings of England, known as in Latin as Historia Regum Britanniae, was completed in 1138. It contains the first narrative account of Arthur's life. And this work is really an imaginative and fanciful account of all the British kings, from the legendary Trojan exile Brutus up to the 7th century Welsh king Cadwallader. Now, Geoffrey says that Arthur was a descendant of Constantine the Great. He writes about Arthur's father, Uther Pendragon, his magician advisor Merlin, and the story of Arthur's conception, in which Uther, described as the enemy Golorus, Gorlois, by Merlin's magic, sleeps with Gorlois's wife. Igraine at Castle Tentacle, where she conceives Arthur. He also writes on Uther's death. He writes about the 15-year-old Arthur, who succeeds him as King of Britain and fights a series of battles, culminating in the Battle of Bath, where he defeats the Anglo-Saxons. He defeats the Picts and the Scots before creating an Arthurian empire through his conquests of Ireland, Iceland, and the Orkney Islands. After 12 years of peace, Arthur sets out to expand his empire once more. Again, this is in Geoffrey, and he takes control of Norway, Denmark, and Gaul. Gaul is still in the Roman Empire when it is conquered, and Arthur's victory leads to further confrontations with Rome. Arthur and his warriors, including Kay, Bedivere, and Gawain, defeat the Roman Emperor Lucius Tiberius in Gaul, but as he prepares to march on Rome, Arthur hears that his nephew, Mordred, whom he had left in charge of Britain, has married his wife Guinevere and seized the throne. Arthur returns to Britain and defeats and kills Mordred on the river Camblum in Cornwall, but he himself is mortally wounded. He hands the crown to his kinsman Constantine and is taken to the Isle of Avalon to be healed of his wounds and never to be seen again. So that's kind of, all of that is the outline of what happens in Geoffrey of Monmouth's telling of the story of Arthur. Now, how much of that narrative was Geoffrey's own invention is open to debate. He seems to have borrowed the list of Arthur's 12 battles against the Saxons, found in the 9th century Historia Brittonum, along with the idea that Arthur was still alive after the Battle of Camlan from the Annales Cambriae. And Arthur's status as the king of all Britain seems to have been taken from pre-Galfridian traditions of Wales. Finally, Geoffrey borrowed many of the names for Arthur's possessions, like Excalibur, close family members, like Uther, and companions, like Sir Gawain, from the pre-Galfridian Welsh tradition. However, while names, key events, and titles may have been borrowed, there have been relatively few modern attempts to challenge the notion that Geoffrey's book is primarily his own creative work. Well, whatever his sources may have been, the immense popularity of Geoffrey's history cannot be denied. Over 200 copies of the manuscript in Latin are still known to exist, as well as translations into other languages. As a result of this popularity, Geoffrey's book was enormously influential on later medieval development of the Arthurian legend and the magical, wonderful adventures of romance tales. By the way, what do we mean by literary romance? Romance is a genre developing from the mid-14th century on, which deals with love or heroic adventures. They're both in prose and in verse form. Now, the plots of these prose and verse pieces are set in distant times and distant places, remote from everyday life. The supernatural element is present in many of these medieval romances. Further, chivalric romances are fantastic stories about marvel-filled adventures, often of a knight portrayed as having heroic qualities, who goes on a quest. Chivalry, right? Chevalier from the French knight. Chivalric romances put the emphasis on love and courtly manners and are distinguished from other kinds of epic tales in which masculine military heroism predominates. Indeed, the popularity of Geoffrey's Historia gave rise to a significant number of new Arthurian works in continental European literature during the 12th and 13th century, particularly in France. Perhaps the most significant effect of this great outpouring of new Arthurian storytelling was on the role of the king himself. Much of this 12th century continental and later Arthurian legend centers less on Arthur himself than on characters such as Lancelot and Guinevere, Percival, Galahad, Gawain, and Tristan and Isolde. Whereas Arthur is very much at the center of pre-Galfredian material and Geoffrey's Historia itself, in the post-Galfredian romances, he's often kind of put to the side. His character also alters significantly in later literature in both the earliest materials, in later materials, I should say. That's where it alters significantly. Because in the early materials and in Geoffrey, Arthur is a great ferocious warrior who laughs as he personally slaughters witches and giants and takes a leading role in all his military campaigns. Whereas in the continental romances, the post-Galfredian literature, he often becomes the quote unquote do nothing king, whose inactivity and acquiescence constituted a central flaw in his otherwise ideal personality and in his ideal society. Arthur's role in these works is frequently that of a wise, dignified, even tempered, somewhat bland, and occasionally feeble monarch. Nevertheless, whatever his faults and frailties may be in these romances, his prestige is never, or almost never, compromised by his personal weakness. His authority and glory remain intact. Now, while Arthur and his retinue appear in some of the poems of Marie de France, it was the work of another French poet, Chrétien de Troyes, that had the greatest influence with regard to the development of Arthur's character and legend in the post-Galfredian era. Chrétien wrote 5 Arthurian romances between the years 1170 and 1190. Eric and Enid, Clages, which is a kind of a courtly a tale of courtly love within Arthur's court as the backdrop. And it definitely it marks a shift away from the heroic world of the Welsh and Galfredian Arthur. And then we have Ivan, the Knight of the Lion, which features Ivan and Gawain in a supernatural adventure, with Arthur very much on the sidelines and weakened. However, the two most significant development of the Arthurian legends from Chrétien are Lancelot, the Knight of Cart, which introduces Lancelot and his adulterous relationship with Arthur's Queen Guinevere, extending and popularizing the recurring theme of Arthur as a cuckold, and Percival, the story of the Grail, which introduces the Holy Grail and the character of the Fisher King, with Arthur having a much reduced role. Thus, Chrétien was absolutely instrumental in the development of the Arthurian legend, and much of what came after him in terms of the portrayal of Arthur himself and his world. The Percival poem, particularly, although unfinished, was extremely popular, with the quest for the Holy Grail slowly replacing the prominence of Arthur himself in Arthurian legends. Similarly, Lancelot and his cuckolding of Arthur with Guinevere became one of the classic motifs of the Arthurian legend. Chrétien's work even appears to feed back into Welsh Arthurian literature. So after he writes, Welsh writers started using Chrétien as a source. Particularly significant in the development were 3 great Welsh Arthurian romances, very similar to those of Chrétien. One's called Owen, or The Lady of the Fountain. That's related to Chrétien's Ivan, I should say. Geraint and Enid. Well, that relates to Eric and Enid by Chrétien. And Purdur, son of Efrog, is very similar to Percival. Now, up around 1200, continental Arthurian romance was expressed primarily through poetry. But after this date, the tales began to be told in prose. The most significant of these is a 13th century romance called the Vulgate Cycle of the Holy Grail, a series of Middle French prose works written in the first half of the 13th century that continued the trend towards reducing the role played by Arthur through the introduction of Galahad and an expansion of the role of Merlin. It also made Mordred the result of an incestuous relationship between Arthur and his sister Morgause, and established the role of Camelot as the center of Arthur's court. This series of texts was quickly followed by another cycle that included the Suite de Merlin, that focused more on the quest for the Holy Grail. Well, the development of the medieval Arthurian cycle and the character of the Arthur of romance culminates in one of the great works of Western literature called Le Morte d'Arthur, Thomas Malory's retelling of the entire legend in a single work in English in the late 15th century. Malory based his book on various previous romance versions, in particular the Vulgate cycle, and appears to have aimed at creating a comprehensive and authoritative collection of Arthurian stories. Le Morte d'Arthur is one of the earliest printed books in England, published by William Caxton in 1485. So as a result, later Arthurian works, including modern versions, are derivative of Malory. Well, now with all of that said, why don't we summarize some of the important details? In the Arthurian legends, and all of them from pre-Galfredian to Geoffrey's work to post-Galfredian, there are several categories of characters, including one of the most important groups, and that's the Knights of the Round Table. Now, they don't appear in every single version of these stories, both pre and post-Galfredian, but in many of them they do, and when they do appear, they're very important. These are the most famous of Arthur's knights, including Lancelot, Gawain, Tristan, Galahad, Percival, among others. Another important group, of course, is royalty. There's obviously King Arthur, but there's also Queen Guinevere, and in many tellings, King Arthur of Ireland, of Cornwall, I should say. They are some of the central figures in the legend. Another important group, of course, are the wizards, the fairies, and other magical beings. Merlin the wizard is probably the most famous of these, but there are also other magical figures, such as Morgan Le Fay and the Lady of the Lake. Morgan Le Fay is also known as Morgana. Now, another important group are the women of Arthurian legend, of Arthurian Britain and Arthurian legend. The damsels in the Arthurian legend are often at the center of a given story and either need to be rescued by knights or provide motivation for a quest. These are then in the chivalric tales, right? They include women such as Elaine, also known as the Lady of Shalott, and Isolde. In German, the German version is Isolde. These stories are related to the concept of chivalry, which will become a central theme in the 19th century revival of Arthurian stories. Now, just a little sidebar here about chivalry. The ideals described in the Code of Chivalry were emphasized by the oaths and vows that were sworn in the knighthood ceremonies of the Middle Ages. And these sacred oaths of chivalry had strict rules of etiquette and conduct and were publicized in poems and ballads. The wandering minstrels of the Middle Ages sang these ballads and were expected to memorize the words of long poems describing the valor and the code of chivalry that was followed by knights. In some, Arthurian legend revolves around the code of chivalry, which was adhered to by the knights of the Round Table. Honor, honesty, valor, and loyalty. Now, meanwhile, back to the character groups. Another important one centers around the peasants and the commoners. Characters such as Sir Kay, the seneschal, play pivotal roles in the stories as well. And then we have saints and holy figures. Characters such as Joseph of Arimathea also play significant roles in the legend. And finally, we have the Saxons and the Romans. There are a number of characters in some of the stories that are not British in origin, such as Cedric of Wessex, who was a Saxon, or Lucius, who was a Roman. Well, let's focus a little more on what I like to call the big players. Now, these are the most important characters in various Arthurian legends. Of course, there are literally dozens of others, as you saw in that Wikipedia website that I showed you at the beginning of the program, hundreds. But the next 16 are the characters around whom many of the legends revolve. Now, obviously, yes, there's King Arthur. Even when later works put him off stage, his influence stretches across the story. Especially in early works, he's known for his bravery, his wisdom, and his leadership. He's depicted as a powerful king who defeats the Saxons and establishes a vast empire. And then there's Merlin, known primarily for being a wizard, with several other main roles. He's usually depicted as a composite of historical and legendary figures, born of a mortal woman and sired by a male demon called an incubus. He's known for prophecy and shapeshifting, who engineers the birth of King Arthur and serves as Arthur's chief advisor until Arthur's disappearance or death. Of course, there's Guinevere. She is often the primary female character in Arthurian tales. She's the Queen of Great Britain, wife of Arthur, and the prominent figure in the love affair with Lancelot. As a result of that affair, she's depicted as everything from a villainous traitor in some stories to a very noble lady in others. Her relationship with Lancelot is central to many of the tales and assumes a very active role in the 19th century and modern adaptations of her life story. And then there's Lancelot du Lac, one of the greatest knights of the Round Table. He's depicted as King Arthur's close companion and the personal champion of Queen Guinevere. He becomes central to the Arthurian romance tradition as a hero of many battles, quests, and tournaments, who also has a tragic love affair with Guinevere, which causes a civil war that leads to the downfall of Arthur's kingdom. Now, Morgana, or Morgan Le Fay, is a complex character in the Arthurian legends who undergoes many psychological changes throughout different texts. She's originally depicted as the ruler of Avalon and a healer, but later becomes more of an antagonistic figure towards King Arthur and is associated in some tales with paganism and female sexuality. Morgan Le Fay's duality and her ability to use magic have made her a popular subject in contemporary texts, where she is sometimes portrayed as, well, she's good or she's evil or she's somewhere in between. Mordred is another complex character in the Arthurian legend, who has been portrayed as both a knight and as a traitor. He is usually depicted as the villainous son of King Arthur and Morgause, who desires to claim the throne and is eager to bring about the end of Camelot. Mordred is often portrayed as being in love with Queen Guinevere and fighting Arthur for both the throne and Queen Guinevere's heart. Now, depending on the interpretation or the version of the story, either Arthur kills Mordred or Mordred kills Arthur, or in some versions, both happen. And this is at the Battle of Camlan. He is most widely considered a villain and is even included in the lowest circle of hell for traitors in Dante Alighieri's Inferno. Now, Sir Gawain is a legendary knight who is best known from the 14th century romantic epic Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. He is the half-brother of Mordred and the son of Morgause and King Lot, and is often depicted as a model of chivalry and goodness. In one of the greatest of the Arthurian romances, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight by the Pearl poet, Gawain defends King Arthur against a mysterious knight who challenges the knight to a strange game. Gawain accepts the challenge in Arthur's name and beheads the Green Knight, only to go on a quest to find him a year later and prove his greatness as an honorable knight. Another primary character is Elaine of Astolat. She's a character in Arthurian legend who is known for her unrequited love of Lancelot. Her story is told in Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, and in the 19th century through Alfred Lord Tennyson's famous poem, The Lady of Shalott. In these stories, Elaine nurses Lancelot back to health after he is wounded in a tournament, but he leaves her to return to Guinevere. So Elaine dies of a broken heart, and her image as a woman whose love goes unrequited has inspired many paintings and works of art, such as the one that I just popped up on the screen. Now we have Morgause. She's the sister of Morgan Le Fay. Now, originally called Anna in Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, Morgause's character was fleshed out in Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur. In his version, she marries King Lot of the Orkney Islands and has 4 sons with him, all of whom serve Arthur as knights of the Round Table. However, she is also the mother of Mordred through an incestuous affair with King Arthur, and her unlucky affairs lead to her death. Very complicated character, and really depends on which version of the Arthurian legend that you read. Now, Galahad, well, he's an important character. He's a knight known for being the noblest knight chosen by God to discover the Holy Grail. He's the son of Lancelot and is famous for his purity, which is linked to his success in finding the Holy Grail. Galahad's reputation as a sinless knight is a stark contrast to his father Lancelot's reputation for extramarital affairs, and Galahad's virginity has become an important aspect of his story in the Arthurian legend. The Lady of the Lake, also known as Vivienne or Nimue, is a powerful and influential figure in Arthurian legends. She resides in a castle beneath the lake that surrounds Avalon and is responsible for gifting Arthur with his sword Excalibur. She's also responsible for bringing him to Avalon to heal him, and in some versions of the story of the Arthurian legend, she actually raises Lancelot into adulthood. Her relationship with Merlin is also a subject of debate, with some stories depicting her as a lover and teacher of magic, while others show her as the one who imprisons Merlin. The Lady of the Lake's morally ambiguous character is typical of many female characters in Arthurian legend. Tristan A friend of Lancelot and one of the Knights of the Round Table is the legendary hero of the Tristan and Isolde story, first recorded in the 12th century. In it, he falls in love with the Irish princess Isolde while escorting her to marry King Mark of Cornwall, leading to an adulterous relationship, eventual banishment, and death. Isolde is a legendary Irish princess who is the main character in several Arthurian romances, and of course in Wagner's trailblazing opera Tristan and Isolde. She's most widely known for her love affair with Tristan after they accidentally drink a love potion, and for their tragic end when Tristan is killed by King Mark and she dies of a broken heart. Although in some versions of the story, she dies in Tristan's final embrace. So in some versions, she dies in his arms, and in some versions, she dies years later of a broken heart. And yes, there are several biblical characters who are part of the Arthurian romance tradition. Joseph of Arimathea, who's said to have taken the body of Jesus after the crucifixion and given him a proper burial, is a figure in several of the legends and is said to have brought the Holy Grail to Great Britain. Uther Pendragon is the father of King Arthur and the previous king of Britain. He's often depicted as a brave and just ruler who paved the way for his son's rule. And last but not least, we have Igraine, who is the mother of King Arthur and the wife of King Uther Pendragon. Now, she was originally married to King Gorlois before the king was killed in battle through the magic of Merlin. Now, Uther is the one who kills Gorlois. Igraine's daughters are Morgause, Elaine, and Morgan Le Fay, and they are the result of a prior marriage. Now, with all of that said, let's explore the decline and revival of Arthur's story and how he's become central to numerous modern retellings of his life and adventures. The end of the Middle Ages brought with it the waning of interest in King Arthur. Although Malory's English version of the great French romances, well, they were popular, they were increasing attacks upon the truthfulness of the historical framework of these Arthurian romances, established since Geoffrey of Monmouth's time, and thus the legitimacy of the whole matter of Britain. Social changes associated with the end of the medieval period and the Renaissance also conspired to rob the character of Arthur and his associated legends of some of their power to enthrall audiences, and with the result that 1634 saw the last printing of Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur for nearly 200 years. So there's a steady decline. Now, King Arthur and the Arthurian legend were not entirely abandoned, and he was often used simply as a vehicle for allegories of 17th and 18th century politics. Thus, Richard Blackmore's epics Prince Arthur in 1695 and King Arthur in 1697 feature Arthur as an allegory for the struggles of William III and James II. Similarly, the most popular Arthurian tale throughout this period of the 17th and 18th century seems to be that of Tom Thumb, which was first told through chapbooks and later through the political plays of Henry Fielding. Although the action is clearly set in Arthurian Britain, the treatment is humorous, and Arthur appears as a primarily comedic version of his romantic character. And the 18th century poet John Dryden's allegorical opera, King Arthur, is still performed, largely thanks to Henry Purcell's music. But in the early 19th century, medievalism, Romanticism, and the Gothic revival reawakened interest in Arthur and the medieval romance. A new code of ethics for 19th century gentlemen was shaped around the chivalric ideals embodied in the Arthur of romance. This renewed interest first made itself felt in 1816 when Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur was reprinted for the first time since, as I said, since 1634. Now, preeminent among these was Alfred Lord Tennyson, whose first Arthurian poem, The Lady of Shalott, was published in 1832. His Arthurian work reached its peak of popularity with the epic-sized Idylls of the King, a work that reshaped the entire narrative of Arthur's life for the Victorian era. Comprised of 12 narrative poems, the work was published between 1859 and 1885. The first volume, which included the first 4 poems, sold 10,000 copies within the first week. In these dozen masterpieces, Arthur becomes a symbol of ideal manhood who ultimately fails, through human weakness, to establish a perfect kingdom on earth. Tennyson's works prompted a large number of imitators, generated considerable public interest in the legends of Arthur and the character himself, and brought Malory's tales to a wider audience. Indeed, the first modern English version of Malory's work was published in 1864. The reprint that was earlier in the century was in the original language. This was a modern English version that was published in 1862. And that was shortly after the first poem of the Idylls appeared. And there were 6 further editions of Malory's work before the end of the century. Now, this interest of the Arthur of romance and his associated stories continued through the 19th and into the 20th century, and it influenced poets like William Morris, the pre-Raphaelite artists, including Edward Burne-Jones, and numerous composers, including Wagner, whose operas Lohengrin, Parsifal, and Tristan and Isolde, 3 operas, are all based on Arthurian legends. Now, here are a few of the great Arthurian works created by the English pre-Raphaelite artists and their followers, who saw in the Arthurian legends all the greatest attributes of chivalry and tragic romance. Now, on the page right now, you see the arming and departure of the knights, an enormous tapestry designed by William Morris and produced by his company, which also produced spectacular wallpaper and furniture. And by the way, if you own a Morris chair, that's named after William Morris. Here we have 2 different interpretations of The Lady of Shalott by William Holman Hunt and William Maw Egley. And here are images of King Arthur by Charles Ernest Butler on the right, and A Dream of the Past, Sir Isumbras at the Ford by John Everett Millais. That's on your left. The revival of Arthurian romance also proved influential in the United States, with books such as Sidney Lanier's The Boy's King Arthur from 1880, which reached wide audiences. And Arthurian romances definitely proved an inspiration for Mark Twain and his great satire, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court from 1889, which was made into an absolutely delightful Hollywood musical in 1949, starring no less than Rhonda Fleming, William Bendix, and Bing Crosby. Now, sadly, the horrors of World War I damaged the reputation of chivalry, of knighthood. As a result, interest in its medieval manifestations and in Arthur as a chivalric role model kind of began to wane. Yet the tradition did remain sufficiently powerful to persuade Thomas Hardy and John Masefield to compose Arthurian plays, and T.S. Eliot to use aspects of the Arthur myth in his poem, The Wasteland, which focuses in on one of its sections on the tale of the Fisher King from Arthurian legend. However, by the later half of the 20th century, the influence of the Romance tradition of Arthur rebloomed in all of the arts. In writing, T.H. White's The Once and Future King from 1958, Mary Stuart's The Crystal Cave from 1970, and especially Marion Zimmer Bradley's The Mists of Avalon from 1982, well, they were all hits and had become modern classics. These writers and many others have reworked the material for modern sensibilities to be more consistent with the values such as equality and democracy. Further, some tales take a decidedly feminist approach to Arthur and to his legend. Now, the Arthur of romance has also become popular in film and theater. Lerner and Loewe created the hit musical Camelot in 1960. And Walt Disney scored nicely with the animated film The Sword and the Stone in 1963. Other notable Arthurian ventures include Excalibur from 1981, First Knight from 1995, King Arthur from 2004, and Legend of the Sword from 2017. And yes, let's not forget the Arthurian spoof Monty Python and the Holy Grail from 1975, which in turn became the basis for the hit 2005 Broadway show Spamalot. Meanwhile, attempts to portray Arthur as a genuine historical figure of the early 6th century stripped away the romance. Well, those have also emerged. This trend became dominant in the years following the outbreak of the Second World War, when Arthur's legendary resistance to Germanic enemies struck a chord in Britain. Clemence Dane's series of radio plays, The Saviors, from 1942, used a historical Arthur to embody the spirit of a heroic resistance against desperate odds. And Robert Sheriff's play, The Long Sunset from 1955, saw Arthur rallying a Romano-British resistance against the Germanic invaders. This trend towards placing Arthur in historical setting is also apparent in historical and fantasy novels published during this period. Arthur has also been used as a model for modern-day behavior. Founded in the 1930s and revived in the 1990s, the Order of the Fellowship of the Knights of the Round Table is rooted in Arthurian sensibilities. According to its website, the Fellowship, which is headquartered in Cornwall, is based on the symbolism and ideals of the Arthurian tradition, and more specifically, care and consideration for our fellow human beings. Non-sectarian, non-political, and without creed or bias, it aims to bring together men and women from all corners of the world, where a sense of belonging and communication will bring contact, knowledge, and pleasure, enriching all our lives. Now, similar organizations, primarily for young people, also developed in the United States during the Depression and the World War II era. And Arthur's diffusion within modern culture goes beyond such obviously Arthurian endeavors. As Norris Lacey has observed, there can be no doubt of the extent to which a legend born many centuries ago is profoundly embedded in modern culture at every level. In other words, Arthur is still very much with us. And one of the most popular ways to connect with Arthur and his world is through video games. And on your screen, you see just a handful of the literally dozens available today. And let's not forget about television series, many of which can be accessed through services like Amazon and Netflix. The website Rotten Tomatoes lists the titles on your screen as the 8 best shows about King Arthur. It's an impressive list, to be sure, and illustrates how the story of Arthur has been remodeled for the modern age and remains an indelible part of the human imagination. So, whew, I threw an awful lot at you. There we have a brief overview of one of the great characters in both literature and history, the one and only King Arthur. From the legends of ancient Britain to Geoffrey of Monmouth to Thomas Malory to the romances of Europe to the great revival of the 19th century to continued influence in modern media, Arthur remains a central figure in culture worldwide. So I hope you've enjoyed this taste of Arthur's world. For more detailed information, please visit my website, makingwings.net, and take Deeper Dive number 87. And now, before we talk about our next presentation, let's hear some of your thoughts and ideas.